Okay, so when you're dealing with promissory notes, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. The first thing is you need to look at the terms. So we're going to write down up here, we're going to write down terms. And then you have to figure out, okay, if we've got terms, we must be trying to determine something. What are we trying to determine about a promissory note or a notes payable? A notes payable has interest rates attached to it. And of course, if it has interest rates attached to it, it has, as the introduction to this chapter talks about, it has a time frame attached to it. So you have a formula where we're going to write down formula. The third thing it's going to have is it's going to have some kind of a journal entry, because you want to keep track of when the loan was taken out, how much of the loan was paid over time, if there was any interest accrued that hasn't been paid yet but we owe it. Because remember, if you have interest, you also have expense. You have an interest expense, and expenses can be written off on your taxes. So we're going to have some way to keep track of this, which we, of course, will call a journal. And we'll write down up here, journal. So we have three things that we have to start with. The first thing is the terms. The second is the formula, and the final thing is your journal entries. Okay, so if you have terms, you have a number of terms you have to deal with. The first one is the promissory note itself. Well, as I tell people when I'm dealing with accounting, always sound it out and see what the words themselves mean. Well, promise. What does a promise mean? Promise is something you tell somebody that you're going to fulfill in the future. I make you a promise. Well, a promissory note would be a promise that I'm going to fulfill something that I've written out on a note. Well, what am I going to write out in a note? Well, we already know that notes payable is one of our liabilities. Well, all of a sudden we have another term, promissory note. Notes payable. In other words, we've got a notes payable. We're going to have to pay in the future. It's payable, and it's a promise to make that payment. We also have the payee. Who's the payee? The payee is the individual who has loaned out the money. So, for example, if I loan you $1,000, I am the payee, because later you're going to pay me the $1,000 plus some interest that we agree upon. Okay, so we have the payee and we have the maker, which would be you. You're making this agreement to pay me in the future. All right. But if I loan you $1,000 today, I'm not going to say you can just come back 10 years from now and only pay me $1,000. Why not? Because I'm a mean man and I'm not going to do it. No, because if I take my $1,000 and invest it in the bank, even at a very low interest rate, I'm going to have more money in the future. Well, if you want to borrow money from me, I'm taking the risk that you may never pay me back. So I want some kind of a return for the risk that I'm going to take. That return for the risk is represented in interest. And so I have some kind of an interest that I'm going to charge you. All right? The principal is going to be the amount that you actually loan. For example, you borrow $1,000. And I'm going to say, okay, you borrow $1,000, but I want you to pay me 10% interest in a year. Well, if it's an entire year, you're going to pay me $1,000 plus 10%, which would be $100. So 1,000 plus 100 would be $1,100 that you'd have to pay back for the right to borrow that money. Okay, the very next thing is the rate. Well, what rate? Well, we just came up with the rate. The interest is the rate of interest. So the rate is 10%. The interest is $100 because it's a one-year loan of $1,000. If it's the entire year, you owe me that 10% interest times 1,000 plus 1,000 for $1,100. And finally, the time. Well, not everybody makes all of their loans on January 1st. Not everybody makes all of their loans on one day and then pays it exactly 1 year later on that particular day. Some people might pay off their loans early. Some people might have late penalties and pay off your loans late. But whatever time there is, it has to be multiplied by your interest rate and your principal. So there we come up with the formula we're going to use, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. Talk about terms, now we're going to talk about the formula. When you're dealing with a note or a promissory note payable, you've made a promise that you're going to pay this. What is it you're going to pay? Well, you've got to figure that out by taking the principal that you originally borrowed, and if you remember, the original amount was $1,000. You borrowed that amount for a period of time at some interest rate. Well, we decided that $1,000 was going to be at a 10% interest rate. Well, that interest rate may be a bit high. You may decide 5%. You may decide 2%. We may say, well, it's too much risk. I want 20%. Some credit cards actually charge 24%. Whatever interest that is, whatever rate that is, we have to take that principal, we have to multiply it by the interest, and then we have to say, well, how long is the loan outstanding? Maybe we only have a 6-month loan, so we have 6 months out of how many months in a year? 12. So we have 6/12 of a year. So this is the formula we're going to use to figure out the notes payable or the promissory note. Principal times interest times time. Okay. So 1,000 times 10% is how much? Obviously, $100. But times 6/12, which is 1/2, is only $50. And that's $50 interest that you're going to have to pay. You're not going to pay $100 because you didn't have it for the entire year. You're only going to pay $50 of interest. Well, you're still going to have to pay the maturity back, so you're going to have to pay that $1,000 back at the end of the loan period, but you're also going to have to pay $50 because you took that money out and you're going to have to pay it back plus interest. So in total, you'd end up paying back $1,050.